Hi guys, it's Agnieszka from 5 Minute Language. Welcome to my channel. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't already and give this video a thumbs up. I really appreciate it. So today I've got a new video for you in the series Is X Language Difficult to Learn? And I'm going to talk about Chinese, which many people think is a very difficult language to learn. So I'm going to share with you my take on it and the things that make Chinese a difficult language, but also that make it relatively easy to learn. So let's get started. So the first thing to say is that when we say Chinese, we mean different things sometimes. So what I'm going to talk about here is Mandarin Chinese, which is the most widely spoken variety or dialect of Chinese. So I'm going to focus on that. So let's start with the things that make Chinese a difficult language to learn. So the first one is probably, you guessed it right, the fact that it's not written phonetically and it's the writing system. So if you've ever learned Japanese, for example, you will know that there are 3 different writing systems in Japanese and 2 of them are phonetic, which means that you can write words and then once you know the alphabet, which consists of 20-something letters, you will be able to decipher it because it is phonetic. Just like English is phonetic. When you look at it, even if you don't know the words, you can read it out. Whereas when you look at Chinese and you don't know the symbol that you're looking at, you won't be able to actually read it out because it's not phonetic. There's no clues as to how it should be pronounced. So that makes it slightly difficult. There are obviously thousands of characters in the language, and that can make it really overwhelming, especially when you're only just starting out. So it's a commitment you have to make when you start learning Chinese that you will need to learn hundreds and thousands of characters. But you know, when learning any language, you need to learn hundreds and thousands of words because without that, you won't be able to advance, you won't be able to become fluent. So the thing is, when you're learning a Latin-based language like Italian, for example, a lot of the time you can kind of guess. You can read it out, you can guess the meaning, you can guess the pronunciation, and most often you will get it kind of right. Whereas with Chinese, you can't really fake it. You either know it or you don't know it. You either know how to say it or you don't know how to say it. You either know what it means or you don't know what it means. And that is quite crazy. The next thing about pronunciation is that Chinese is a tonal language. So in principle, there are 4 different tones, which means that each word can be pronounced in 4 different ways. If you're used to learning languages like English or a European language, usually when you look at a word, it can only be pronounced in one way. There are some exceptions to that, but mostly that's how it works. Whereas in Chinese, there are several different possible pronunciations of the same thing, and they often mean something completely different. So it's a bit like singing. You know, when you're singing a song, you get the tune wrong, nobody will know what you're actually singing, like what song it is. And it's the same in Chinese. Misunderstandings can happen because you got the tone wrong. So that takes me on to the next point about Chinese being difficult, which is that it's difficult to practice listening in general because of the tones, which are kind of quite similar to each other. So in any other language, you would be able to practice listening from the beginning, whereas in Chinese, it seems like you have to kind of master the tones before you can move on to really practicing your listening skills properly. The next thing is limited access to teachers and lessons in most countries. So in some countries, you can learn Mandarin Chinese quite easily. So for example, in the UK, you could find a native speaker to kind of exchange languages with. So they would be learning English, you'd be learning their language. So you do kind of like a language exchange. You can find classes in central London, for example. But in many different countries, Chinese is not really a popular language to learn. There isn't a big kind of minority that speaks that language. And it's just not something that kind of many people want to do. So your access to a teacher or a class that isn't online can be limited. So the next thing about Chinese is that you express things completely differently. So for example, there's no tense, there's no plurals, there's no articles. So all of these things that you're familiar with as an English speaker kind of disappear, and you have to find a different way of expressing those ideas with the language. So it's like a completely new way of thinking that you have to adapt before you can kind of call yourself a Chinese speaker. There are not many grammatical or structural similarities between Chinese and English. That's another difficulty. And you can't really rely on cognates. So cognates are basically vocabulary items, words or expressions that are similar in different languages. So for example, if I say the word information in French, you will know that means you will know it's information because of the similarities between the two languages. Whereas in Chinese, you can't really rely on that. You have to kind of accept that you will be learning things from scratch and there won't be many cognates. So the next thing is when you're learning Chinese, you might end up being able to speak but not being able to read, which is quite interesting because when you're learning a kind of Latin-based language such as French, often you will be able to read as an English speaker more fluently, so to speak, than speak the language, because speaking always kind of comes second for most people. Whereas with Chinese, especially if you go to China, you will be exposed to the language in your everyday situations. So for example, you will be going to the shop and people will be asking you things like anything else, or whether you want a bag and stuff like that. And you will be familiar with those expressions and you will be able to say them yourself without knowing how they're written. So that's kind of interesting and something that you should be prepared for, I guess, when you're learning Chinese. So let's move on to the things that can make Chinese relatively easy to learn. So the first one is the availability of native speakers. So obviously there are a lot of people in China that you can connect with, that you can do language exchanges with, like I mentioned before. And obviously the availability of native speakers is also true in many different countries in the world where there are people who speak Chinese, Mandarin Chinese, as their second or first language. So the thing is, many Mandarin Chinese speakers want to learn English. So if you're an English speaker, or if you either native or you speak English as a foreign language, you won't find it difficult to arrange a language exchange because there will be a lot of people who want to exchange their language for your language. So if I was just a Polish speaker, which is my native language, and I didn't speak English, I might struggle to find somebody to language exchange with. I would have to find a Chinese speaker who wants to learn Polish, which I think probably happens, but not very often. The second thing is it is possible to memorize the writing system, and you can use mnemonics, which is a technique for memorizing vocabulary, and you can really do that effectively. So I've got a separate video about mnemonics and I want to direct you to that, so make sure you check it out. It's in the description box. But basically mnemonics is all about creating kind of like mental images, looking at a character and thinking about what it resembles, and then thinking up like a little story in your head about that thing. So it is possible to use mnemonics, and it's actually incredibly helpful when learning languages like Chinese or Japanese. So sentence structure in Chinese is actually relatively easy. It's subject, verb, object, so the same as in English, for example. And basically, like I mentioned, there's no like insane number of tenses and moods that you have to memorize. So when you're learning English for the first time, I can't remember the exact number, but I think there's like 15 or 18 different tenses in English. So that can be quite scary. And then you've got Chinese where like you don't have to do any of that, which is amazing. There is obviously a different way of expressing present, past, and future. But the main thing is that you don't have to be kind of overwhelmed from the start with learning lots of different grammar structures. There's no gendered nouns. So when you're learning Spanish, for example, you have to memorize what's feminine, what's masculine. In Polish, it's even worse because there's the neutral gender. But in Chinese, that doesn't exist. So you learn vocabulary items just once and you don't have to remember anything else about them. You also don't have to conjugate any verbs. So conjugation is all about how the verb changes depending on its function in the sentence. So, for example, in English, you say, I go, but you say she goes. So go and goes are two separate forms, two separate conjugations that you have to remember. And English is easy in that respect because if you're learning Polish or French or Italian, you will come across a lot of different forms. Whereas in Chinese, you don't have to do that. The next relatively easy thing about Chinese, or something that helps with learning it, is that characters can be combined together. So, you know, just like compound nouns in Latin-based languages, nouns can be combined to create compound nouns. For example, a car wash is a compound noun. So you combine the words car and wash, and you know, you don't have to remember that car wash is a car wash, because you would work it out anyway, even if you didn't know that word. It's a place where you wash a car. And it's the same in Chinese. There's a lot of things that combine together, and if you know the basic pronunciations or the basic meanings, you will be able to work out things by yourself. And you know, the more you learn, the more you will be able to do that. Okay, so I hope I convinced you that Chinese is not really a scary language to learn. It can be a bit overwhelming, and obviously there's a lot of different things that make it difficult, but there's also a lot of things that are hopefully reassuringly easy or relatively easy, and I wish you all the best if you're considering learning it. So make sure you subscribe to my channel and give this video a thumbs up, and I'll see you next time. Bye!